Now, there was a rich kid, a baker, and a wine taster, all down on their luck and found themselves in prison. No money, no bread, no wine. And the jailer, being a bit of a wag, he came in one day with some pillows for them. They weren't used to the pillows, a bit like some of the guys we heard earlier on the streets of London. And he gave them, but they had thin coverings on them. So in the middle of the night, they burst. And he came in the morning and he saw them covered in all the feathers. And he said, "Why are you so down in the mouth?" When you're feeling down, what kind of support works for you? I'm not talking about pillows now, am I? What kind of support works for you? Someone to talk to? Someone who'll listen, and I mean truly listen? Someone to distract you and to take you out of yourself? Someone who can offer you advice? Or just someone who can accompany you through life's ups and downs? Now, earlier we talked to the children about Jesus, how he had everything up in heaven, absolutely everything, and how he gave it all away to be with us. But then ultimately he returned to glory. But he gave everything to walk alongside us, to be a support to us, side by side, in whatever kind of things life might like to throw up. Now I want to concentrate slightly more for a moment on our Old Testament reading for a few moments. You'll recall we read from Genesis 45, where we were learning a little bit more about the story of Joseph. And I hope that you're familiar with the story of Joseph, not just the Technicolor dream coat, as some people call it, the coat of many colors, but some of the other events that happened within his life. Because at this point in his life, we come across an older and a wiser Joseph than the one who perhaps humiliated his brothers, unintentionally or otherwise, in his youth. And he experienced all sorts of different things. Like Jesus, Joseph had everything at the start of his life. He was born into a fairly affluent family, had all the means that they needed, but he was to lose it. Unlike Jesus, he didn't choose his humiliation. He didn't choose it. We recall the story. He was cast out by his brothers and actually had a narrow escape from death on that particular account, but was sold into slavery. He had a hard life whilst in slavery. He was wrongly accused of rape, and he was imprisoned for it. And this wasn't the kind of prisons that we see in Britain in the 21st century. The hardships of prison over 3,000 years ago were much closer to perhaps some of the things we hear of in some parts of the Middle East, where humanitarian concerns are the last thing on people's minds. While he was there, as the rich kid, he met a baker and a wine taster. He wasn't given a pillow. He might have been down in the mouth, but he wasn't given a pillow. But with God's help, things started to get better. There was light at the end of the tunnel, even though at that time he could not see it. And with God's help, it did get better, and eventually he found himself in a position of power and authority and was able to help even his brothers who had cast him out with murderous intent. But now he was faced with a very difficult decision indeed, a different decision. A decision of whether or not he would show forgiveness. He decided to test his brothers, to see whether they were still of an envious bent. And they passed the test. I wonder whether or not, had they failed that test, he might still have been so forgiving. And there's a little part of me that thinks that perhaps he would. Perhaps he would. Because for all their failings, and they'd already demonstrated to him so many failings in their treatment of him, their woeful treatment of him. Even for all their failings, they were still family. He still loved them. These were the brothers whom he had grown up with. He was close to them. And the reason that I suspect that that's perhaps the case is his reaction once he shows himself to them. He must have been in turmoil. For days now, if not weeks and months, he's known who they are, but they've not known who he is. And he has been in turmoil. And when this last revealing is about to take place, he sends all the Egyptians from the room, so there's just himself and them. And then he breaks down. And he breaks down to such an extent that his cries are heard throughout the whole of the palace, amongst all of the Egyptians, and they must have wondered what was going on. Because here was Joseph with his family reunited once again. How do we endure hard things? What kind of support would we wish when hard things come? Sometimes people are to blame. Sometimes there are estrangements within families. And perhaps sometimes we think on it and think there are very good reasons for why there are estrangements within families. Some things seem to even break that almost indissoluble union of blood. And they say that blood is thicker than so many different things. But there are some experiences that seem to break up these kind of relationships. Are there second chances? Do they come along? Are individuals given an opportunity, or maybe just through life, come good? Is that always necessary, wholly necessary, for forgiveness to be shown? How do we cope within the difficulties of life, whether it's to do with family or not? How do we forgive? Joseph had first-hand experience of forgiving being treated absolutely appallingly. And yet, he forgave with outcries of a heart that was desperate to forgive in that particular situation. Now, perhaps remembering the story of Joseph helps. Or if that isn't powerful enough in and of itself, the story of Jesus, who gave his all to those who rejected him, including us, perhaps at various times in our lives, and who willingly forgave, and even forgave on the cross. Do we have it in ourselves to show that kind of forgiveness? Do we have it in us to demonstrate it and to help those perhaps even who are in need, even when they've wronged us? It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. Now, at this time, there are several in our congregation, as there always are. It's an ongoing thing, it's a human complaint, but there are several in our congregation who are going through hard times, perhaps with family, unknown to myself. I'm not picking on any particular examples here, but hard things within life, things to do with illness, things to do with hospital, things to do with bereavement, reminders of various things, circumstances with work, circumstances with how they occupy themselves, maybe even in retirement from work, from paid workful gain. What do we do to alleviate their suffering? Are we like an angel of God? Are we present with them, trying to assist them in some way? And what kind of help is most beneficial for them? Is it the hearing ear? Is it the advice? Is it someone just alongside them, or some practical means of assistance? Knowing that sometimes can be very difficult. Knowing what someone needs in any given circumstance can be incredibly difficult indeed. If we're in that kind of a position, are we willing to be helped? Are we willing to suggest what it is that would help by way of support? Perhaps we haven't even got the words. One experience that I had extensive experience of was within a chaplaincy. I was working with someone that you know very well, Blair Robertson, who was the assistant here in this congregation for some time. And whilst working with him in a chaplaincy role in the hospital, some of his words of wisdom were around even that ability to be in alongside somebody. To zip this and to open two of these. To listen to people. To sit with them. To spend time with them. And sometimes, even though it costs so little in monetary terms, that's all some people really want. Or it's the most powerful help and support that we can possibly give them. In silence, alongside people, even when we don't know what to say. Alongside them in their suffering, and even perhaps alongside them in our suffering. You see, this isn't limited to just helping those who are in need when we have needs also ourselves. Yes, some people are worse off than ourselves, perhaps. We could view it from that way. But even when we have needs ourselves, being able to give in that kind of a way, it truly is a blessing. Can we sit with them? I offer this as an avenue of service for us all, each and every one of us, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. I especially offer it to our elders, many of whom are hardworking in this regard. And I'd encourage you to redouble your efforts to just get alongside one another. But this is the whole people of God. And something as simple as that is not restricted just to our elders or the minister. Each of us have an opportunity, perhaps, to do something like that. Joseph had no one. Jesus had no one. Sometimes we might feel as though we haven't a friend in the world. But Jesus was victorious in his experience so that he might always be with us. And if the church is doing her job, and if we in turn let her do her job by letting them in, we can enjoy the presence of the saints and be blessed by it. May we offer and may we enjoy that kind of support.